Don't stand there. Wait outside. The sentence landed sharp and public, cutting clean through the quiet luxury of the lobby like it didn't belong there, like it was never meant to be questioned. And for a moment, everything else, the polished marble floors, the glass walls reflecting a skyline worth billions, the soft hum of filtered air, seemed to hold its breath around it, as if the building itself was watching what would happen next. And right in the center of it all stood Darius Cole, still, composed, dressed in a plain black hoodie, dark jeans, and worn sneakers that didn't match the $40 million property he had walked into without announcement, without escort, without anything that would signal to anyone in that room that he wasn't just another man they thought they could redirect, dismiss, and reduce to nothing more than a problem to be moved out of sight. And the man who said it, a tall white manager in a tailored navy suit with a silver name badge that caught the light just enough to feel intentional, didn't hesitate, didn't soften his tone, didn't even lower his voice as nearby guests turned their heads, curious at first, then quietly attentive as the moment stretched, because this wasn't just instruction, it was judgment dressed up as policy, and Darius didn't respond right away, didn't shift his weight or raise his voice. He simply looked at the man the way someone does when they've seen the pattern before, when the outcome is already written but the process still needs to play out, and that silence, calm, deliberate, unmoved, did something to the room. It unsettled it, because people expect reaction, they expect defense, explanation, something they can push against, but what they got instead was presence, and presence, when it's that steady, has weight. And the manager felt it even if he couldn't name it. So he doubled down, took a step closer, gestured casually toward the glass doors behind Darius, as if pointing out an obvious rule everyone else already understood. Staff and deliveries use the side entrance, he added, louder now, making sure others heard, making sure the narrative formed exactly how he wanted it to. And a few heads nodded without knowing why, because confidence often sounds like authority when no one questions it. And near the reception desk a young employee paused mid-typing, her eyes flicking between them, unsure, while a couple seated in the lounge leaned forward slightly, not enough to intervene, just enough to witness, and still Darius didn't move, didn't correct him, didn't offer credentials or explanations or anything that would make this easier for the people trying to define him in real time. Because ease wasn't the point, truth was, and truth, he knew, had timing, and this wasn't it yet. So instead he let the moment expand. Let the tension settle into the walls, into the polished surfaces that had seen deals closed. And fortunes built, because what was happening now wasn't new. Not for him, not for the system that produced it. And somewhere beneath the surface of his stillness was memory. Not loud, not overwhelming. Just present, the echo of doors that didn't open, rooms he was told weren't meant for him. Conversations that ended before they began because someone had already decided what he was worth based on what he looked like walking in. And that memory didn't ignite anger, it refined it into something quieter, something sharper, something that didn't need volume to be heard. And the manager, misreading the silence as compliance, gave a small, satisfied nod like the situation had already resolved itself in his favor, like this was routine. Like this man in front of him would step aside and disappear into the margins where he believed he belonged. And that assumption, that quiet confidence built on nothing but appearance, was exactly what Darius had come to test, because earlier that morning, miles away in an office overlooking the same city, a report had landed on his desk. Complaints, patterns, language that repeated itself in different forms but always pointed to the same underlying issue. And he had read every line. Not with surprise, but with recognition, and instead of sending emails or scheduling meetings or delegating the issue down a chain of people who would sanitize it into something manageable, he chose something else, something direct, something undeniable. He chose to walk in, unannounced, unguarded, and see it for himself. And now here he was, exactly where those reports said he would be, hearing exactly what they described, and for a brief second, just long enough to register it. He let that confirmation settle, not as disappointment, but as clarity, because clarity removes hesitation. And hesitation is the only thing that keeps moments like this from turning into something irreversible. And behind him the glass doors reflected the scene back in fragments. Figures, movement, tension, like a mirror that didn't quite want to show the whole truth at once. And in that reflection, you could see the shift beginning, subtle but real, the way conversations in the room slowed, the way attention gathered, the way uncertainty crept into places where certainty had just stood. And it was in that exact moment, not before, not after, that Darius finally moved, not stepping back, not turning toward the exit he had been directed to, but reaching calmly into his pocket, pulling out his phone with emotion so controlled it almost felt rehearsed, though it wasn't. It was simply practiced in the way that comes from knowing exactly what matters and what doesn't. And as the screen lit up in his hand, the manager's expression changed just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough to signal that something had slipped out of alignment, that the script he thought he was following had just been interrupted by something he didn't understand. And Darius glanced down at the phone, not rushed, not reactive, just precise, as if every second had already been accounted for. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried anyway, clean and steady through the space like it belonged there more than anything else in the room. "Start internal recording," he said. And there was no explanation attached to it, no context offered, just a directive that landed with the kind of weight that doesn't come from tone but from certainty. And for the first time since this interaction began, the manager hesitated, just a fraction, just enough for the shift to become visible, because that sentence didn't fit the role he had assigned to the man in front of him. It didn't match the expectation, and when expectations break, even slightly, everything around them starts to loosen. And somewhere behind the desk the young employee froze completely now, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, eyes locked on Darius as if trying to place him in a category that suddenly didn't make sense anymore. And a guest near the window lowered his coffee slowly, attention fully captured, while another reached discreetly for their phone, not to interfere, just to remember, because something about this moment felt like it wasn't going to end the way it started. And Darius, still holding the phone, lifted his gaze back to the manager, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, recognition, as if he had already seen the end of this exchange and was simply allowing it to unfold at its natural pace. And the air in the lobby shifted again, quieter now, heavier, like a pressure change before a storm that no one had officially acknowledged yet, but everyone could feel. And then, just before anyone could speak, just before the manager could recover the control he thought he had, Darius added one more line, just as measured, just as precise. "Pull every management contract tied to this building." And this time the silence that followed wasn't passive, it was active, charged, because even without understanding the full meaning of those words, the room understood their direction, and direction, when it's that clear, doesn't need explanation. It demands attention, and for the first time, the question wasn't whether Darius belonged there. It was who, exactly, had made the mistake of thinking he didn't. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, stretching the moment into something heavier than a simple misunderstanding. And the manager felt it now, that subtle shift he could not quite explain, like the ground beneath his authority had just tilted a few degrees off balance. But instead of stepping back, he straightened his posture, adjusted his cuff as if resetting the scene, and forced a short laugh that did not quite reach his eyes. Because confidence, once questioned, has to be performed twice as hard to survive. "You can record whatever you want," he said, voice tightening just enough to betray the crack forming underneath. "But policy does not change." And the word policy landed again, familiar, rehearsed, something he had used many times before to close conversations before they could open. And for a second it worked. The room leaned toward it. People like rules, they like structure. They like believing there is a system that explains everything. But Darius did not respond to the word. He let it sit there unanswered, because he understood something the manager did not, that policy is only powerful when it is applied fairly, and the moment it becomes selective it turns into something else entirely, something that exposes the people behind it, and that exposure had already begun, even if no one had said it out loud yet. And near the reception desk the young employee finally lowered her hands completely, no longer pretending to work, her attention fixed entirely on the exchange, because the tone had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that instinct told her this was no longer routine. And across the lobby a man in a gray suit leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms slowly, watching with the kind of interest reserved for moments that feel like they might matter. Later, while a woman beside him whispered something under her breath, not to interfere, just to mark the tension, and Darius, still calm, still steady, glanced briefly at the screen of his phone as if confirming something only he could see, then slipped it back into his pocket with the same measured control he had shown from the beginning. And that small action, simple as it was, seemed to echo louder than anything spoken so far, because it signaled completion, not uncertainty, and the manager noticed it, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to decode a message he had not been invited to read. And for the first time since he had spoken, he hesitated before continuing. If you are here for a delivery or maintenance, you need to check in through the proper channel, he added, softer now, attempting to reframe the situation into something procedural, something safe, something that could still end without consequence. But the words no longer carried the same authority they had moments ago, because the room had already begun to question the premise they were built on, and Darius tilted his head just slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement, like someone hearing a familiar argument they had outgrown years ago. And in that subtle movement was a quiet kind of finality, the kind that does not announce itself but becomes obvious once it is too late to change direction. And then, without raising his voice, without stepping closer, he spoke again. You are not enforcing policy, he said, each word clear, evenly spaced, leaving no room for misinterpretation. You are choosing who it applies to. And that sentence did something the previous ones had not. It turned the focus away from him and back onto the system the manager believed he controlled, and suddenly the conversation was no longer about where Darius should stand. It was about why he had been told to move at all, and the manager felt it, the shift in attention, the way eyes that had been casually observing were now actively evaluating. And for a brief second his composure slipped, not completely, not enough to lose face, but enough to reveal that this was no longer as simple as he had assumed, and he glanced toward the security desk, a silent cue, a habit built from experience. Because when words stop working, presence often fills the gap, and almost immediately a uniformed guard stepped forward, not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough to establish a boundary, to reinforce the idea that this was still under control, and the guard's expression was neutral, professional, but uncertain, because even he could feel the tension that had settled into the space, and uncertainty, when it appears in systems built on certainty, spreads quickly, and Darius noticed him. Of course he did, but he did not react, did not acknowledge the movement as a threat, or even as an escalation. He simply let it exist, because it was part of the pattern, part of the sequence he had seen before, and somewhere beneath that calm was a memory, not sharp, not overwhelming, just present enough to inform the moment, a memory of being told to wait in places where others walked freely, of being asked for proof when others were assumed to belong, and each time, back then, there had been a choice. Push back and risk being labeled difficult, or comply and carry the weight quietly. And over time that choice had shaped something in him. Not resentment, not bitterness, but precision, the ability to recognize exactly when a moment required silence and when it required something else. And this, he knew, was the turning point, the place where silence had done its job and clarity needed to take its place. And the room felt it before he spoke, that subtle tightening, that shift from observation to anticipation, like the pause before a verdict is read, and the manager, sensing it without understanding it, took a half step forward, as if proximity could restore control. Sir, he said, the word more formal now, more cautious. I am going to need you to either step outside or provide identification. And there it was, the final attempt to reduce the situation to something manageable, something he could still direct. But the request, simple as it sounded, carried the weight of everything that had happened before it, because it was not just about identification, it was about justification, about proving a right that had already been assumed for others. And Darius looked at him, really looked this time, not as an obstacle, not as an opponent, but as a man standing at the edge of a decision he did not yet realize he had already made. And when he spoke again, his voice did not change, it did not rise or harden. It remained exactly what it had been from the start, calm, controlled, undeniable. You already decided who I was the moment I walked in, he said, and the words landed with a quiet force that spread through the room like a ripple, because everyone there understood the truth in them, even if they had not admitted it before, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke. The system had been named, and once named, it could not hide behind procedure anymore, and in that stillness, something irreversible began to take shape. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, like glass under pressure, and the first crack came from somewhere unexpected, a voice not loud, not commanding, but clear enough to shift the weight in the room. "He is right," the young employee behind the desk said, her words careful but steady, and for a second it seemed like even she was surprised she had spoken, her eyes flicking briefly toward the manager before settling back on Darius. Because once something is said out loud, it cannot be unsaid, and the manager turned toward her sharply, not with anger, not openly, but with that controlled disbelief reserved for moments when someone steps out of line in a system built on staying in it. "This is not your concern," he replied quickly, his tone tightening again as he tried to pull the moment back into something he could manage. But the room had already shifted, and one voice, even a quiet one, has a way of giving permission to others, and across the lobby the man in the gray suit uncrossed his arms, leaning forward now, no longer just observing but engaging. "What exactly is the policy here?" he asked, not confrontational, just direct, and that question, simple as it sounded, carried weight because it demanded clarity, not assumption, and clarity is where inconsistencies begin to show, and the manager hesitated again, just a fraction longer this time, because answering it meant committing to a position that could be measured, and measured positions can be challenged, and for the first time since this began, he did not have complete control over how that challenge would unfold, and the security guard, still standing nearby, shifted his stance slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting, as if instinct was telling him this situation was no longer as straightforward as it appeared, and Darius watched it all without interruption, without inserting himself into the exchange, because the moment had begun to move on its own, and when truth starts to surface organically, forcing it can weaken it, and he understood that, so he let it breathe, let the questions form, let the discomfort settle where it needed to, and the manager, feeling the pressure, now from more than one direction, straightened again, his voice taking on that familiar tone of practiced authority. "We require all non-registered individuals to check in through designated access points," he said, choosing his words carefully, as if precision could restore control, and for a second it almost worked. The sentence sounded official, structured, something that could pass without deeper examination. But the young employee spoke again, this time more certain. "That is not how we handle visitors in the main lobby," she said, and the room reacted, subtle but immediate, a shift in posture, a glance exchanged, because contradiction, when it comes from within, carries more weight than anything from outside, and the manager turned toward her fully now, his composure tightening like a knot pulled too far. "I said this is not your concern," he repeated, more firmly, but the repetition only highlighted the instability beneath it, and Darius saw it, the moment where authority begins to rely on insistence instead of certainty, and that moment, he knew, was the beginning of collapse, not loud, not dramatic, but inevitable once it starts. And near the glass doors a woman who had been quietly watching raised her phone slightly, not to record aggressively, just to capture, because something about this interaction had crossed from ordinary into something that felt like it mattered beyond the moment. And the man in the gray suit spoke again, this time more pointed. "If he is being asked to leave, there should be a clear reason," he said, and now the question was no longer isolated. It had become shared, and shared questions create pressure, the kind that systems built on assumption struggle to withstand, and the manager exhaled slowly, trying to regain control, trying to reassert the structure he believed he represented. "Sir," he said again, turning back to Darius, choosing formality like a shield, "if you cannot provide identification, you cannot remain in this space." And there it was again, the demand for proof, the requirement that had not been applied to others, now presented as neutral, as if neutrality could erase the context that had already been established, and Darius held his gaze, not confrontational, not defensive, just steady, and in that steadiness was something that made the words feel smaller than they were intended to be. And for a brief moment the room seemed to narrow, not physically, but in focus, everything centering on the space between them, the distance between assumption and truth. And then, without raising his voice, without shifting his stance, Darius spoke. "You are asking for proof now," he said, each word measured, deliberate. "But you did not ask anyone else." And the sentence landed clean, not emotional, not exaggerated, just factual, and facts, when placed in the right moment, do not need reinforcement. They carry their own weight, and the manager opened his mouth to respond. But the words did not come immediately, because responding required either denial or acknowledgement, and both carried consequences he had not prepared for. And the delay, brief as it was, said more than any answer could have, and the room felt it. That pause, that hesitation, the small but undeniable sign that something was not aligned, and Darius, still calm, still composed, let the silence extend just long enough for it to settle. Because silence, when it follows truth, amplifies it. And then he reached into his pocket again, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise, and pulled out his phone once more, the screen lighting up in his hand like a signal. And this time when he spoke, there was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. "Bring up the ownership registry for this property," he said, his voice steady, controlled, and the words moved through the room differently than anything before them, because they did not address the situation, they redefined it. And in that redefinition was a shift so complete it could not be ignored. And for the first time since this began, the question was no longer about whether he belonged there. It was about who had the authority to decide that in the first place. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and deliberate, like something the room was not ready to hold. And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because ownership registry was not a phrase that belonged in a casual exchange. It carried weight, structure, consequence, and the manager felt it immediately, even if he did not fully understand why. His expression tightening just enough to reveal that something had shifted beyond his control, and he glanced toward the reception desk, toward the systems he believed he understood, as if looking there might restore the clarity he had just lost. But the young employee was already moving, her fingers returning to the keyboard with a new kind of urgency, not hesitant anymore, not uncertain, but focused, because the instruction she had just heard did not sound like a suggestion. It sounded like something that came with authority, and authority, when recognized, changes behavior instantly. And the screen in front of her flickered as she navigated through internal systems most guests never knew existed, her eyes scanning quickly, searching, confirming, while the manager stepped closer, his voice lowering now, no longer projecting to the room, but directed sharply at her. "Stop that," he said, controlled but strained. "You do not have authorization to access those files." And the words were meant to re-establish hierarchy, to remind her where she stood. But hierarchy only holds when belief supports it, and belief had already begun to fracture, and she did not stop, her hands continuing to move with a quiet determination that surprised even her, because sometimes clarity arrives not as confidence, but as the absence of doubt. And in that moment, she knew something was wrong with how this was unfolding, and she was not willing to ignore it. And the manager saw it, the defiance, subtle but undeniable. And for the first time his composure slipped in a way that others could see, not dramatically, not enough to lose face entirely, but enough to expose the pressure building underneath. And he turned back to Darius, his tone sharpening. "You are escalating a situation that does not need to exist," he said, choosing his words carefully, trying to reframe the narrative, to make this about disruption rather than truth. But the attempt landed weakly, because the room had already moved past that version of events, and Darius did not respond immediately. He did not defend or argue or explain. He simply stood there, steady, present, allowing the system to reveal itself in real time. And that patience, that refusal to rush, began to feel like control, not passivity. And the security guard, still positioned nearby, shifted again, his stance no longer as certain as before, because uncertainty had reached him too, the subtle awareness that something larger than routine was unfolding. And across the lobby the man in the gray suit leaned forward further, his attention fully engaged now, while the woman beside him lowered her phone slightly, not because the moment had lost significance, but because it had gained clarity, and clarity changes how people witness. And then the screen at the reception desk stopped flickering. The young employee's hands pausing as her eyes fixed on something that held her there. And the stillness of that moment spoke louder than any announcement. Because discovery, when it happens, has a way of freezing everything around it. And she did not speak right away, did not turn or react. She simply stared, processing, confirming. And the manager noticed, his gaze snapping toward her, searching her expression for something he could use, something he could control. But what he found instead was something else entirely, something that did not align with his expectations. And that misalignment unsettled him more than any direct challenge could have. "What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice lower now, tighter, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of what she was about to say. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, clear, carrying just enough to reach everyone who needed to hear it. "The primary ownership listing," she said, and the words landed differently than anything else that had been spoken so far, because they were not opinion, not interpretation, they were data, and data, when verified, does not bend. And the manager's expression changed again, this time more visibly, his confidence pulling back just enough to reveal something closer to concern. "That is restricted information," he replied quickly, almost reflexively, as if labeling it could contain it. But containment requires control, and control had already begun to slip, and the young employee turned the screen slightly, not fully, not for everyone to see, but enough to confirm what she had already recognized, and her eyes moved from the display to Darius. And in that brief exchange something passed between them, not spoken, not acknowledged, but understood, recognition. Meeting confirmation, and the room felt it even if they could not name it. That subtle shift from question to answer. And the manager took a step closer now, his composure tightening again as he tried to regain ground. "This does not change the fact that he has not identified himself," he said, louder now, addressing the room as much as anyone, attempting to pull the focus back to procedure, but the effort felt strained, like a line repeated too many times to remain convincing. And Darius finally moved, not stepping forward, not closing distance, just enough to shift the center of attention back to him. And when he spoke, his voice remained exactly what it had been from the beginning, calm, measured, undeniable. "You did not ask who I was when I walked in," he said, each word landing clean. "You decided who I was." And the sentence settled into the space with a weight that could not be redirected. Because it did not argue, it revealed, and once something is revealed, it cannot return to being unseen. And the manager opened his mouth again. But the words did not come immediately, because there was no response that could undo what had already been exposed. And the room held that silence, not empty, but full, charged with the understanding that something irreversible had just taken place. And in that stillness, the balance of power, once assumed, quietly began to shift in a direction no one in that room had expected. The silence did not fade. It deepened, settling into every corner of the lobby like a weight no one could ignore. And the manager felt it pressing against him now, not from one direction, but from all sides, from the quiet attention of the guests, from the stillness of the security guard, from the unwavering presence of Darius standing exactly where he had been told not to stand, and most of all from the screen behind the desk that no longer belonged to his version of the story. And he tried to recover, tried to gather the authority that had come so easily just minutes ago. But authority, once questioned in public, does not return the same way. It hesitates, it fractures, and the more it is forced, the more obvious the cracks become. "This does not prove anything," he said, his voice sharper now, louder, reaching for control through volume. But the words landed without the certainty they once carried, because everyone in the room had already seen the shift, had already felt the imbalance, and the young employee did not look away from the screen, her voice steady, almost quieter than before, but somehow stronger. "It shows full ownership under Darius Cole Holdings," she said, each word clear, deliberate, leaving no room for reinterpretation, and the name moved through the room like a current, subtle but undeniable, because names carry recognition even when faces do not. And somewhere in the back of the lobby someone whispered it again, slower this time, as if confirming what they had just heard, and the man in the gray suit leaned forward fully now, his attention locked, his earlier curiosity replaced with certainty, because he had heard that name before, not in passing, but in rooms where decisions shaped entire markets, and the manager heard it too. And for a brief second something flickered across his face, not disbelief exactly, but resistance, the instinct to reject what does not fit the narrative already chosen. That is not possible. He replied quickly, almost too quickly, as if speed could override fact, but the denial sounded thinner than the statement it followed, and the room recognized it immediately, because truth, once spoken with clarity, does not need defense, while denial often does, and Darius remained still, unchanged by the shift around him, his posture steady, his expression calm, not triumphant, not reactive, just present, as if this outcome had never been in question, and that calmness did something the manager could not counter. It made everything else feel louder than it needed to be, more forced, more exposed, and the security guard took a small step back without realizing it, his body adjusting to a new understanding before his mind had fully processed it, because instinct often recognizes power before logic catches up and across the room. The woman who had been recording lowered her phone completely now, not because the moment had ended, but because it had transformed into something else, something less about capturing and more about witnessing, and the manager turned back toward the desk, his movements tighter now, less fluid, as if each step required more effort than the last. "Verify it again," he said, his voice lower, controlled, but carrying an urgency he could no longer hide, and the young employee nodded once. Already ahead of him, her fingers moving across the keyboard with precision, pulling up additional layers of confirmation, timestamps, linked accounts, documentation that aligned in ways that could not be easily dismissed, and each new detail that appeared on the screen did not just support the claim, it reinforced it, building a structure of fact that stood in direct contrast to the assumption that had started all of this. And the manager watched, his eyes fixed on the display, as if searching for an inconsistency, something he could use to regain control, but there was nothing there that bent in his direction, nothing that could be reshaped into the narrative he needed, and that realization did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like something unavoidable finally being acknowledged, and the room felt it, that quiet collapse, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. The moment when authority shifts without announcement, and Darius finally moved again, just enough to step into that space where uncertainty had been, not to dominate it, not to claim it visibly, but to exist in it with a clarity that made everything else align around him. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm it had from the beginning, but now it held something more, not added, not forced, just revealed. "You asked me to wait outside," he said, each word measured, steady, "in a building my company owns." And the sentence did not rise, it did not push, it settled, final, undeniable, and the weight of it moved through the room in a way that changed how everyone stood, how they looked, how they understood what had just happened. Because it was no longer about a misunderstanding, it was about a decision made too quickly, based on something too shallow, and now exposed in a way that could not be undone, and the manager did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to say that would restore what had been lost, and in that silence, the structure he had relied on began to dissolve, not completely, not yet, but enough that the outcome was no longer in his hands, and everyone in that room, whether they realized it or not, had just witnessed the exact moment where power changed direction. The sentence did not echo, it settled, and in that settling something final took shape, not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible, and the manager felt it before he understood it, the quiet realization that the ground he had been standing on was no longer solid, that the authority he had leaned on had shifted beneath him without warning, and for a moment he said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because anything he said now would be measured against a truth that had already been established, and that kind of comparison rarely ends well for the one trying to recover. And around them the lobby had transformed, not physically, but in energy, the casual movement of guests replaced with stillness, conversations paused mid-sentence, attention fully anchored to the center of the room where Darius stood, unchanged, unshaken, as if the entire situation had simply caught up to where he had been all along, and the young employee behind the desk remained focused on the screen, her Posture no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain, but aligned with something she could now clearly see, and that alignment mattered. Because when systems begin to correct themselves from within, the correction carries more weight than any external force ever could, and the manager exhaled slowly, a controlled release that attempted to mask the pressure building underneath. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the earlier sharpness, but not yet accepting, not yet willing to fully yield. If that is the case, he said carefully, choosing each word as if stepping through something fragile, then there must be some misunderstanding. And the phrase sounded familiar, almost routine, the kind of language used to soften mistakes after they have already been made. But the room did not accept it the same way it might have before, because this was not a misunderstanding, it was a decision. And everyone present had seen exactly how that decision had been formed, and Darius did not interrupt, did not challenge the statement directly. He simply let it exist, because sometimes allowing a weaker version of events to present itself is more revealing than rejecting it outright. And the manager continued, filling the silence he could no longer control. We have protocols in place to ensure security and order, he added, attempting to anchor himself back to structure, to something that sounded legitimate. But the words felt thinner now, like something repeated without the certainty that once supported it. And the man in the gray suit spoke again, this time without hesitation. Protocols should apply the same way to everyone, he said, his tone calm but firm, and the sentence did not accuse, it clarified, and clarity, once introduced, reshapes everything around it. And the manager turned toward him briefly, acknowledging the presence of a voice he could not easily dismiss, and then back to Darius, as if trying to find a path through a situation that no longer had one. And Darius finally moved. Not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but just enough to shift the center of the moment fully onto himself. And when he spoke, his voice remained exactly what it had been from the beginning, steady, controlled, carrying weight without effort. You are right, he said, addressing the man in the gray suit, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Protocols should apply the same way to everyone. And the repetition of that idea, now coming from him, did something different. It did not just clarify, it confirmed, and confirmation, when it aligns with truth, settles deeper than argument ever could, and the manager felt it, the narrowing of his options, the closing of space where he might have redirected the outcome. And for the first time since this began, his posture shifted in a way that was visible, not a collapse, not yet, but a retreat from certainty into something closer to caution. And the security guard stepped back another inch, subtle but undeniable, his role in the situation diminishing as the need for it dissolved, because authority had already been redefined without him. And the young employee turned slightly now, enough for others to see the screen, not fully exposed, but enough to confirm what had already been stated, the name, the ownership, the structure that connected it all, and the visual evidence carried a weight that words alone could not. And a quiet murmur moved through the room, not loud, not disruptive, but present, the sound of understanding spreading, and Darius let it happen, did not rush to close the moment, did not push for reaction, because this was not about proving a point, it was about revealing a pattern, and patterns, once seen clearly, do not need to be forced into recognition, they stand on their own. And then, after a pause just long enough to let everything settle, he reached into his pocket again, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise, and pulled out his phone. The same controlled motion as before, and when he spoke, it was not to the room, not to the manager, but into the device itself, his voice calm, direct, unmistakable. Initiate executive review for on-site management, he said, and the words moved through the space differently than anything that had come before them, because they were not part of the conversation. They were the consequence of it, and consequences, once set in motion, do not wait for permission, and the manager heard it, understood enough to recognize its significance even if he did not yet grasp the full extent, and something in his expression shifted again, this time not just uncertainty, but realization, the slow, undeniable understanding that this moment was no longer contained within the lobby, that it had extended beyond it into systems and structures he could not control. And the room felt it too, that expansion, the sense that what had started as a simple exchange had become something larger, something with reach, and Darius lowered the phone slightly, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, and in that stillness was the clearest signal of all, that everything that needed to happen next had already been set into motion, and there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to redirect, only the outcome waiting to arrive. The words had already been spoken, the call already made, and now the room existed in that rare space between action and consequence, where nothing moves but everything is changing, and the manager felt it more than anyone else, the quiet unraveling of control he could no longer pretend to hold. Because this was no longer about posture or tone or who could speak the loudest, it was about structure, and structure, once activated from above, does not pause for explanation, and he stood there, still in the same place where he had first pointed toward the door, but now that gesture felt distant, almost unreal, like something that belonged to a different version of the moment, and his hands, once steady, now hovered uncertainly at his sides, as if unsure what role they were supposed to play next, and across from him Darius remained exactly as he had been, composed, grounded, not shifting to match the tension around him, not reacting to the discomfort now spreading through the space. Because for him, this was not escalation, it was alignment, the moment where everything matched what it was always meant to be, and that difference, that contrast between stillness and instability, became the new center of the room, and people responded to it without realizing they were doing so. The man in the gray suit straightened fully now, no longer leaning forward, but sitting upright with the kind of attention reserved for moments of decision, while the woman beside him exchanged a quiet glance with someone across the lobby, a silent acknowledgement that what they were witnessing had shifted beyond ordinary. And near the desk the young employee remained focused, but her breathing had changed, steadier now, more certain, because uncertainty had been replaced with confirmation, and confirmation, once internalized, does not require permission to exist, and the screen in front of her remained open. The ownership details still visible, still undeniable, a quiet anchor in a room that had just lost its sense of balance, and the manager looked at it again, not quickly this time, not dismissively, but fully, as if forcing himself to see what he had resisted before, and that act alone carried weight, because acknowledgement is the first step toward accountability, even when it arrives reluctantly, and he swallowed once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But in the stillness of the moment, it was enough to be noticed, enough to signal that something inside him had shifted. Not completely, not yet, but enough to begin, and then his voice returned, softer now, stripped of the earlier certainty. If there has been an error, he began, the words slower, more careful, as if each one needed to be tested before it was spoken. We can address it appropriately. And the sentence attempted to regain ground, to frame the situation in terms that felt manageable, but the room did not accept it. The same way, because this was not an error in process, it was an error in judgment, and everyone present understood the difference, even if it had not been spoken directly. And Darius let the statement settle, did not interrupt, did not correct, because sometimes the way people attempt to reframe their actions reveals more than the actions themselves. And after a brief pause he responded, his voice unchanged, steady, precise. This is not about correction, he said, each word landing clean. This is about accountability. And the distinction, simple as it sounded, cut through the room with a clarity that left no space for reinterpretation, because correction suggests a mistake that can be adjusted, while accountability acknowledges a decision that carries consequence. And the manager felt it immediately, the narrowing of options, the closing of the narrative he had been trying to maintain. And for a moment he said nothing, not because he could not, but because there was nothing left to say that would shift the direction this was now moving in, and the security guard, no longer needed as a presence of enforcement, stepped back completely, his role dissolving into the background where it belonged, and the absence of that presence made the room feel different, lighter in one way, but more exposed in another, because now there was nothing between the situation and its outcome, and the young employee turned slightly, enough to meet Darius's gaze again, and in that brief exchange there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just alignment, as if both understood that what was happening now extended beyond the moment, beyond the lobby, into something larger, something that would not end here. And then a subtle sound broke the stillness, not loud, not disruptive, just the soft tone of an incoming call echoing from Darius's phone, and the timing of it felt precise, almost inevitable, as if the system he had activated had already begun to respond, and he glanced down at the screen briefly before answering, not rushing, not delaying, just moving with the same measured control he had shown from the beginning. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, but now it carried a different kind of weight, not just presence, but authority fully realized. Yes, he said simply, listening for a moment, his expression unchanged, and then, after a brief pause, he added, I am on site, and those 3 words moved through the room differently than anything else had, because they did not explain, they confirmed, and confirmation, when it aligns with everything that has already been revealed, does not need elaboration, and the manager heard it, understood enough to recognize that whatever came next was no longer something he could influence, and the room felt it too, that quiet transition from tension to inevitability, the moment where outcome replaces uncertainty, and Darius lowered the phone slightly, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, and in that stillness was the clearest signal of all, that what had begun as a single sentence in a quiet lobby had now become something far larger, something that would not end with words, but with decisions already in motion. The moment did not explode, it deepened, pulling everything inward as if the air itself had grown heavier, and the sound of his voice on the phone lingered long after the words had ended, not because they were loud, but because of what they carried, and when Darius lowered the device from his ear, the room seemed to recalibrate around him, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that could be felt, like a shift in pressure before a storm fully arrives, and the manager stood frozen in that space, caught between what he had just heard and what he was still trying to believe, his mind moving faster than his posture could follow, searching for something to hold on to, some version of this that could still be controlled, but control had already moved beyond him, quietly, completely, and now all that remained was the awareness of it, settling in piece by piece. And across the lobby the man in the gray suit exhaled slowly, a subtle release that mirrored the understanding forming in his expression, because he knew now, not just in theory but in fact, who he was standing in front of, and recognition, once it arrives, does not leave room for doubt. And the woman beside him leaned slightly closer, her voice barely above a whisper as she said the name again, more certain this time, as if confirming it out loud made it real in a way silence could not. And near the reception desk the young employee straightened fully, no longer half-turned, no longer uncertain, her position now aligned with something undeniable, and she glanced once more at the screen, not to verify, but to anchor herself in what she had already confirmed, and the manager noticed all of it, the way the room had shifted, the way attention had moved, the way certainty had begun to settle everywhere except where he stood, and for the first time since this began, he looked smaller, not physically, but in presence, as if the role he had been playing no longer fit the reality unfolding around him. And he took a breath, deeper this time, more deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice carried something new, not confidence, not authority, but an attempt at recalibration. Mr. Cole, he said, the name landing carefully, almost cautiously, as if saying it correctly might begin to undo what had already been done. If there has been any misunderstanding, we can address it immediately. And the phrasing was different now, more formal, more precise. But the shift in language only highlighted how far the moment had moved from where it started, because respect, introduced after recognition, does not erase the absence of it before, and Darius did not respond right away. He let the words sit in the space between them, not rejecting them, not accepting them, just allowing them to exist as they were, and in that pause was something unmistakable, the quiet acknowledgement that timing matters, and some things, once delayed, lose their ability to change the outcome, and the manager felt it. The weight of that silence, heavier now than any response could have been, and he continued, almost instinctively, as if filling the space might soften it. We value all our clients and partners, he added, the sentence familiar, practiced, something he had likely said many times before, but this time it sounded different, thinner, disconnected from the moment it was meant to address. And the man in the gray suit shifted slightly, not interrupting, but clearly no longer accepting the language at face value, because what had happened was not a failure of Communication, it was a failure of perception, and perception, once exposed, cannot be rewritten with phrasing alone, and Darius finally spoke, his voice calm, unchanged, carrying the same steady weight it had from the beginning. "You did not value me when you thought I was someone else," he said, and the sentence landed without force, without emphasis, but with a clarity that cut through everything else, because it did not argue. It revealed, and once something is revealed, it does not need to be defended, and the manager's response caught for a fraction of a second, his composure tightening again as he searched for something that would hold, something that would stabilize the situation he could no longer control. And then another sound entered the space, subtle at first, but unmistakable as it grew closer. The distinct rhythm of footsteps moving with purpose across the polished floor. From the far end of the lobby, and the timing of it aligned too perfectly to be ignored, because systems do not move slowly once they are activated, they respond, and the response had arrived, and heads turned almost in unison, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the shift in focus, and a small group approached, dressed differently from the rest of the staff, their presence not loud, not forceful, but precise, intentional, and as they moved closer, the dynamic of the room adjusted. Again, not through words, but through recognition, because authority, when it is real, does not need to announce itself. It is understood, and the manager saw them. And in that instant, whatever uncertainty had been forming settled into something more concrete, something closer to realization, and his posture changed again, not outwardly dramatic, but enough to signal that the moment he had been trying to contain had now moved beyond him entirely. And Darius did not turn immediately, did not acknowledge their arrival with urgency or relief, because for him this was not unexpected. It was the next step in a process he had already set in motion, and that consistency, that refusal to react to what others might see as escalation, reinforced everything the room had already begun to understand, that this was never about confrontation, it was about truth revealing itself at the exact pace it needed to. And as the group came to a stop just behind him, the space seemed to settle into a new configuration, one where the question was no longer what had happened, but what would happen next. And in that stillness, with every eye now fixed on the center of the room, the outcome that had once seemed uncertain now felt inevitable, not because it had been declared, but because it had already begun. The shift was no longer subtle. It had taken shape, defined itself, and now stood fully present in the room, carried in the quiet authority of the individuals who had just arrived, their pace measured, their expressions composed, and their focus directed not at the crowd, not at the space, but at Darius, and that alone was enough to redraw every line that had existed moments before, because recognition, when it comes from within the system itself, does not hesitate, it confirms. And the manager saw it immediately, the way they stopped just behind Darius without question, without introduction, as if the hierarchy he had believed he represented had just revealed a level above him that he had never truly considered. And for a brief second his posture stiffened, an instinctive attempt to hold on to something that was already gone, and then the lead among them, a woman in a tailored charcoal suit with a badge that carried a different weight than any in the room, stepped forward just enough to be seen, her voice calm, professional, but unmistakably aligned, with authority that did not need to prove itself. "Mr. Cole," she said, and the way she said his name carried recognition without hesitation, without uncertainty, and that single acknowledgement moved through the room like a final confirmation, because it did not question, it did not verify, it accepted, and in that acceptance everything that had been unfolding clicked into place, and Darius turned slightly, not fully, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge her presence, and there was no surprise in his expression, no reaction to the shift, only continuity, as if this moment had always been part of the path he had already chosen. And the woman continued, her tone steady. "We have reviewed the situation as it is unfolding in real time," she said, and the phrasing itself carried weight, because it meant this was no longer contained within the walls of the lobby. It had extended into systems, into oversight, into layers of accountability that operated beyond individual perception. And the manager felt that expansion like a tightening around the space he once occupied, because it meant the narrative was no longer his to shape, no longer his to contain, and he took a small step forward, almost reflexively, as if proximity might allow him to re-enter the conversation on his own terms. "There has been a misunderstanding," he began again, his voice controlled but strained, repeating the same framing that had already begun to collapse. But this time the words did not carry. They did not settle. They hovered briefly before dissolving under the weight of what had already been established, and the woman did not look at him immediately, did not interrupt. She simply let the statement pass, and in that lack of acknowledgement was something more definitive than any response could have been, because it signaled that the framing he was attempting to maintain no longer held relevance. And when she finally turned her attention toward him, her expression remained neutral, professional, but there was a clarity in it that left no room for misinterpretation. "This is not being reviewed as a misunderstanding," she said, her voice even, precise, each word placed carefully. "It is being reviewed as a failure to apply policy consistently." And the distinction landed with a weight that shifted the room once again, because it moved the situation out of the realm of error and into the realm of accountability. And accountability, once defined, does not allow for retreat, and the manager felt it, the final narrowing of space where he might have redirected the outcome. And for a moment he said nothing, not because he could not, but because there was no version of this that returned him to where he had started, and the young employee behind the desk remained still, her hands resting lightly on the keyboard, her eyes moving between the screen and the unfolding scene, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, just witnessing the alignment of what she had already confirmed with what was now being declared. And the man in the gray suit leaned back slightly, his posture shifting from engagement to observation again. But this time the observation carried a different tone, one of closure rather than curiosity, because the answer had arrived. And the woman beside him lowered her gaze briefly before looking back up, her expression reflecting the same understanding that had settled across the room. And Darius remained at the center of it all, unchanged, his presence steady, not expanding to fill the space, not contracting in response to it, simply existing with a clarity that made everything else organize around him. And when he spoke, it was not to correct, not to explain, but to continue what had already been set in motion. "Ensure that every interaction is logged," he said, his voice calm, direct, carrying the same measured authority as before, including the language used and the decisions made prior to verification. And the instruction moved through the room differently than the earlier statements, because it did not address the moment, it documented it. And documentation, once initiated, transforms an event into a record, something that exists beyond perception, beyond interpretation. And the woman nodded once, a small, precise acknowledgement that required no elaboration, and the manager heard it, understood enough to recognize that what had begun as a single interaction had now become part of something far larger, something that would not end when the room emptied, and his posture shifted again, not outwardly, but enough to signal the internal realization that had finally taken hold, that this was no longer a situation he could resolve with words, no longer something that could be reframed or softened. It had moved beyond him entirely, and the room felt it, that quiet finality. The moment where outcome replaces uncertainty completely, and in that stillness, with every element now aligned, the story of what had happened no longer needed to be told. It had already been seen, already been understood, and now it was simply waiting to be acted upon. The air did not move, but everything inside it had already changed, and what remained was no longer tension. It was clarity settling into place, steady and unavoidable. And the woman in the charcoal suit did not raise her voice, did not step forward with force or urgency. She simply continued, her tone measured, her presence controlled in a way that made every word carry further than volume ever could. "Effective immediately," she said, and the phrase alone shifted the room again, because it marked a line, not between before and after, but between assumption and consequence. And the manager felt it as something final, something that did not require agreement to take effect, and she continued without pause. "All decision-making authority for on-site management is suspended pending executive review." And the words landed with precision, each one closing a door that had once been opened to him, each one removing a layer of control he had relied on without question just minutes earlier. And for a brief second his posture stiffened, not in defiance, but in recognition, because even before he could process the full meaning, he understood the direction, and direction, once established at that level, does not reverse easily. And around them the room absorbed it, the quiet realization that what had begun as a single interaction had now reached a point of formal consequence. And the young employee behind the desk lowered her hand slightly, not in uncertainty, but in acknowledgement, her role in the moment complete. Her part in revealing the truth now aligned with the outcome unfolding in front of her, and the security guard, no longer positioned as an enforcer, stepped fully aside, his presence dissolving into the background where it no longer carried purpose. And the man in the gray suit leaned back completely now, his expression no longer questioning, no longer searching, but settled, as if the answer he had been waiting for had finally arrived in full. And the manager stood still, not speaking, not interrupting, because there was nothing left that would change what had already been set in motion, and silence, in that moment, was not emptiness, it was confirmation. And the woman continued, her gaze steady, not shifting, not wavering. All interactions from this point forward will be conducted under direct oversight, she said, and the phrasing carried more than instruction, it carried structure, the kind that replaces individual discretion with accountability that cannot be bypassed. And the manager's eyes moved briefly, not searching, but registering, taking in the presence of the others who had arrived. With her, the alignment in their posture, the absence of hesitation in their expressions, and in that brief glance he saw what had changed, not just in the room, but in his position within it. And that realization did not arrive loudly. It settled, heavy and quiet, like something that had always been there, but had only just been acknowledged. And Darius remained exactly where he had been, his presence unchanged, not stepping forward to claim anything, not stepping back to relinquish anything, simply existing in the center of a moment that had aligned itself around him without effort. And when he spoke, it was not to assert authority, not to emphasize the outcome, but to define what it meant. This is not about removing you, he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying weight without force. It is about ensuring that what happened here does not happen again. And the distinction settled into the space differently than anything else, because it shifted the focus from individual consequence to systemic correction, and that shift carried a different kind of gravity, one that extended beyond the moment into something larger, something that would continue long after the room emptied. And the manager heard it, understood enough to recognize that this was not personal, even if it felt like it, and that understanding, subtle as it was, changed the way he stood, the way he held himself, not in defense, not in resistance, but in the quiet acknowledgement of a role that had been defined by a decision he could no longer undo. And the woman in the charcoal suit nodded once, a precise, almost imperceptible gesture that signaled alignment with what had just been said. And then she turned slightly, addressing the others who had arrived with her, her voice still even, still controlled. Begin formal documentation and transition protocol, she said. And the instruction moved through the group without hesitation, because systems built on clarity do not require repetition. And one of them stepped toward the desk, another position near the manager, not to confront, not to restrict, but to establish presence, to mark the shift in responsibility that had just taken place. And the room responded again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle ways people adjust when they understand that something has been decided. Conversations that had paused now resumed in low tones. Movements that had been still now returned carefully. But the attention remained, anchored to the center where everything had unfolded, because moments like this do not disappear quickly. They linger. They settle into memory as something that carried more than just its surface meaning. And Darius glanced once around the space, not surveying, not assessing, just acknowledging. And in that glance was something quiet but unmistakable, the understanding that what needed to be seen had been seen, what needed to be revealed had been revealed, and now what remained was not reaction, not explanation, but continuation. And as the system around him moved into its next phase, structured, deliberate, undeniable, he remained still, grounded, a constant point in a moment that had begun with a single sentence and ended with something far more significant, something that could not be reduced to misunderstanding, could not be dismissed as error. because it had already become something else entirely, something defined not by how it started, but by how it was answered. What followed was not loud, not chaotic, but it carried a kind of finality that did not need volume to be understood, the quiet efficiency of a system correcting itself in real time. And the group that had entered the lobby moved with precision, not rushing, not hesitating, each action deliberate, each step aligned with the authority that had already been established, and the manager stood at the center of it, no longer directing, no longer controlling, but present in a role that had shifted. Without his permission, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not attempt to speak, did not try to reframe or recover, because the space for that had closed, and he knew it, not as a sudden realization, but as something that had been building, layer by layer, until there was nothing left to hold on to, and the woman in the charcoal suit remained composed, her attention moving between the individuals carrying out the process and the man who had once stood as the authority in that space. And her presence did not dominate, it structured, it defined the boundaries of what was now unfolding, and near the desk the young employee stepped back slightly, not retreating, but making room for the process that had been initiated, her role complete, her part in the moment acknowledged in a way that did not need to be spoken, and her eyes moved once more toward Darius, not with curiosity now, but with respect, the kind that comes from understanding what she had just witnessed, not just the outcome, but the way it had been carried, the restraint, the clarity, the refusal to react when reaction would have been easier. And across the lobby the guests remained, not leaving, not disengaging, because moments like this hold attention in a way that is difficult to step away from. And the man in the gray suit shifted his posture again, not leaning, not observing casually, but sitting with the awareness that he had just seen something that extended beyond the immediate, something that spoke to a larger pattern. And the woman beside him folded her hands lightly, her gaze steady, as if committing the details of the moment to memory. And Darius remained still, not stepping into the process, not inserting himself into the actions being carried out, because his role in this had never been to manage the response. It had been to reveal the truth that required it. And now that truth was moving forward on its own, structured, undeniable. And when he spoke again, it was not to direct the process, not to emphasize the outcome, but to define the meaning behind it. This building does not belong to one person standing at a desk, he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying without effort. It belongs to a standard, and the words moved through the room differently than anything before them, because they were not about the moment. They were about what the moment represented, and the distinction settled into the space with a clarity that reached beyond the individuals involved, and the manager heard it, understood enough to recognize that this was not about him alone, even though he stood at the center of it. It was about the system he had been part of, the decisions that had been made without question, and the consequences that now followed them. And for a brief second, his posture shifted again, not in resistance, not in defense, but in something closer to acceptance, the quiet acknowledgement of a role that had changed in a way he could not reverse. And the woman in the charcoal suit turned slightly toward Darius, her expression unchanged, but her tone carrying a subtle shift, one that reflected alignment rather than oversight. The transition protocol is in place, she said, and the phrasing confirmed what the room had already begun to understand, that this was not temporary, not a pause, but a restructuring, something that would continue beyond this moment. And Darius nodded once, a small, precise acknowledgement that required no elaboration, and then he looked back toward the manager, not with judgment, not with anger, but with the same steady clarity he had held from the beginning. And in that look was something that could not be mistaken, not a reaction to what had happened, but a reflection of it. And the manager met his gaze briefly, just long enough to register it, just long enough to understand that the moment he had tried to control had revealed more than he intended, and that revelation would not be undone. And then the movement around them continued, structured, deliberate, the process unfolding step by step, each action reinforcing what had already been decided. And the room, once tense, once uncertain, now existed in a different kind of stillness, not waiting, not questioning, but acknowledging. And in that acknowledgement was the clearest sign of all, that what had begun with a single sentence had reached its conclusion not through argument, not through confrontation, but through truth made visible. And as the final pieces of the process settled into place, the moment itself remained, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something precise, something that had shifted more than just a situation, something that had redefined what it meant to belong in that space. And Darius, still composed, still grounded, turned slightly toward the exit, not in retreat, not in departure, but in continuation, because for him, this was never the end of anything. It was simply the point where one truth had been revealed, and the next step had already begun. The movement toward the exit did not signal an ending. It marked a transition, the quiet continuation of something that had already been set into motion long before anyone in that room realized it. And as Darius turned, the space behind him did not return to what it had been. It held the imprint of what had just unfolded, a shift that could not be undone simply because the moment had passed, and the lobby, once defined by its polished stillness and controlled order, now carried something else. Something less visible, but far more permanent. The awareness that standards are not defined by words on a wall, but by actions taken when no one expects to be questioned. And the woman in the charcoal suit remained where she was for a moment longer, her attention moving across the room not to assert authority, but to confirm alignment, ensuring that every element of the process had settled into place. And the individuals working alongside her continued with quiet efficiency, finalizing documentation, confirming transitions, each action reinforcing the structure that had been re-established, and the manager stood slightly apart now, no longer at the center, no longer the axis around which the room moved, but present within it in a way that reflected the shift that had taken place, and his posture had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to signal that something internal had adjusted, something that could not be undone by explanation or justification, and he looked once more toward Darius, who had paused just short of the exit, not leaving yet, not fully disengaged, as if acknowledging that closure, real closure, does not come from walking away but from understanding what remains behind. And their eyes met briefly, not in confrontation, not in resolution, but in recognition, and in that moment there was no need for words, because everything that needed to be said had already been made clear through action, and the young employee behind the desk watched it all, her perspective no longer that of someone observing from the sidelines, but of someone who had been part of the shift itself, and she understood now, in a way that would stay with her long after this day ended, that silence is not always neutrality, and that speaking at the right moment can change the direction of something much larger than the moment itself. And across the lobby the guests began to move again, slowly at first, their conversations returning in low tones, but the way they moved carried something different, a subtle awareness that what they had witnessed was not ordinary, not something that could be dismissed as a brief disruption. And the man in the gray suit stood, adjusting his jacket with a measured motion, his expression thoughtful, as if considering not just what had happened, but what it meant beyond the space they stood in, and the woman beside him followed, her gaze lingering for a moment longer before she turned. Because moments like this do not leave easily. They stay, shaping perception in ways that are not always immediately visible. And Darius finally stepped forward, his movement unhurried, his presence unchanged, and as he reached the doors, he stopped once more, not to address the room, not to revisit what had already been resolved, but to leave something behind, something that would remain even after he was gone. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm clarity that had defined every word from the beginning. Respect is not a reaction, he said, each word deliberate, steady. It is a requirement. And the sentence settled into the space with a weight that did not need reinforcement, because it was not directed at any one person, it was directed at the system itself, the standard that had just been tested and redefined. And the woman in the charcoal suit nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, the kind that confirms alignment without needing to elaborate. And the manager heard it, understood it, not as something imposed on him, but as something that now existed beyond him, something that would continue regardless of his presence. And that understanding, quiet as it was, marked the true conclusion of the moment, not the actions that had been taken, not the authority that had shifted, but the realization of what it all meant. And as Darius stepped through the doors and into the light beyond, the lobby did not return to silence. It held on to something else, something that could not be polished away or reset with routine. The memory of a moment where assumption met truth and was forced to change, and the structure that remained in its wake was not just stronger, it was clearer, defined not by who stood at the desk, but by what was upheld within it. And in that clarity, the space itself seemed different, not because it had changed physically, but because the way it would be experienced from that point forward had been redefined. And that is how moments like this endure, not through noise, not through spectacle, but through the quiet, undeniable shift they leave behind. The doors closed behind him with a quiet precision, not loud enough to mark an ending, but final enough to separate what had just happened from everything that would follow. And outside the building, the city moved the way it always did, steady, indifferent, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside those glass walls. But inside, the lobby did not return to what it had been, because moments like that do not dissolve, they settle. They embed themselves into the structure of a place, changing how it functions long after the people involved have moved on. And the woman in the charcoal suit remained for a moment longer, her presence anchoring the final stages of transition, her eyes moving once more across the space, not in inspection, but in confirmation, ensuring that what had been set into motion would continue without interruption. And the team around her moved with quiet coordination, finalizing the documentation, confirming the reassignment of authority, their actions. Efficient, precise, reflecting a system that had recalibrated itself in real time. And the manager, no longer positioned at the center, stood slightly to the side, his posture no longer shaped by control, but by awareness. And that awareness carried weight, not imposed, not forced, but earned in the most direct way possible, through the exposure of a moment that had revealed more than he intended. And for a brief second, he looked toward the doors where Darius had exited, not with resentment, not with defiance, but with something quieter, something closer to recognition. The understanding that what had happened was not about being corrected in public, but about being shown, in the clearest possible way, the gap between what he believed he represented and what he had actually done. And that gap, once seen, cannot be unseen. And near the desk the young employee exhaled slowly, a breath she had not realized she had been holding, and her hands rested lightly at her sides now, no longer hovering over the keyboard, because her role in the moment had ended, but the impact of it had not, and she knew, without needing to articulate it, that she would carry this with her, not as a memory of conflict, but as a reference point, a moment that defined what it meant to step forward when something was not right. And across the lobby the guests began to disperse more fully now, their conversations quieter, more reflective, not because the event had been loud, but because it had been clear, and clarity lingers in a way noise never does. And the man in the gray suit paused near the exit, glancing back once, not to confirm what had happened, but to take in the space itself, now subtly altered, before stepping out into the flow of the city. And the woman beside him followed, her expression thoughtful, her gaze steady, as if the moment had shifted something in how she saw not just the building, but the systems within it. And inside, the lobby began to settle into its new rhythm, not the same as before, not reset, but adjusted, aligned with a standard that had been tested and reinforced. And the woman in the charcoal suit finally turned, her role in the moment complete. Her presence no longer needed to anchor the space, because the structure she represented had already taken hold. And as she walked away, the team followed, their movements quiet, leaving behind not silence, but order, the kind that does not need to be announced, because it is understood. And the manager remained where he was for a moment longer, not out of uncertainty, but out of acknowledgement, allowing himself to fully register what had happened, not just the outcome, but the process that led to it, the decisions, the assumptions, the point at which he could have chosen differently. And that reflection, subtle as it was, marked the true resolution of the moment, because accountability does not end when authority shifts, it begins there. And as he finally moved, stepping away from the place he had occupied, his posture carried something different, not diminished, but adjusted, shaped by an understanding that would inform every decision that followed. And behind him the young employee returned to her station, her movement steady, her focus clear, not because everything was the same, but because it was not, and that difference mattered. And outside, Darius continued down the sidewalk, his pace unchanged, his presence blending into the rhythm of the city, not standing out, not drawing attention. Because the point had never been visibility, it had been impact, and that impact had already been made, not through force, not through volume, but through clarity, through the simple act of standing still long enough for truth to reveal itself. And as he moved forward, there was no need to look back, no need to revisit what had already been resolved, because for him, this was not a conclusion. It was a continuation, one moment in a larger pattern of ensuring that spaces built on standards actually uphold them. And that is how change takes hold, not in grand declarations, not in dramatic gestures, but in precise, deliberate moments where the gap between what is said and what is done is brought into the light and closed. And inside the building, long after the room had emptied and the voices had faded, that light remained, not visible, not tangible, but present, shaping every interaction that would follow, because once a standard is made real, it does not disappear. It becomes the expectation, and expectations, when upheld consistently, become the new foundation. And that is where the true power of the moment lived, not in what was said, not in what was done, but in what would now continue, quietly, steadily, long after everyone had moved on.